I think that was it for our Nordic sessions. Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome, excellent. Thanks, Nordic Network. That was really fascinating. It's lovely to see such a range of practices. Okay, I'm Lee Rusznyak. I'm from the LCT Wits Hub. And I'm going to talk about pedagogizing LCT in the Teacher Choices in Action project. So what's this all about?
Lee?
Yeah.
You're not from the LCT Hub, you're the director of the hub. Come on.
I'm the director of the Wits LCT Hub, that's it. Thanks, Cole. I'm also the project leader of something that's called Teacher Choices in Action. And since 2020 in South Africa, we've had 44,000 teacher trainees from 24 South African universities do this course. And this course draws strongly on legitimation code theory. So in the session today, I want to talk about the course, what it's all about, why it was necessary, how it came about. Then I want to take you into the course about how we have helped the students to analyze teachers' practice, but also how we've used that to train them up as teachers themselves. So it's on two levels. And then I'd like to talk about teacher education in general and how LCT takes us forward and helps us have a conversation about teacher practice that we haven't been able to have up till now. So that's what we're going to do in this session. And then in the session that follows, Dale Langsford and I are going to look at some of the empirical data of student work that's come out of this project and how we've started to analyze it and what it's showing. So this one's all about the practice. The next one is more focused on the research from the practice. I'd like you to just feel free to jump in, to ask questions, to comment. I'll also stop at various places and we can chat about a couple of things. So please do feel free. Okay, so I think every teacher education program in the world has some sort of work integrated learning where we put students into the classrooms for extended periods of time. And, you know, we've called that a learning in practice approach. And what happened in 2020, of course, when COVID hit, universities around the country had their plans already, you know, to put the students in the schools, and they couldn't go because we had an extended national lockdown and schools were closed. And what that meant was that there was students could not do their practicals in order to graduate. And also universities had this amount of time and they couldn't do, the students, you know, they had nothing planned in terms of work-based learning. So a group of teacher educators from around South Africa, including Carol Bertram and others, came together and we thought, all right, we can't do learning in practice, but perhaps there was another model of work integrated learning that we could develop during the pandemic. And so we adopted a learning from practice, and it led to a module called Teacher Choices in Action. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the resource book that accompanies a 4-week online module. And I'm going to show you a little bit of extracts from that module. And it starts taking Wayne Hugo's work on Bernstein's classification and framing, and the choices that every teacher makes in every lesson, regardless of their subject, regardless of their the context in which they work, and regardless of the age at which they teach. And these are things like, you know, when do you want to bring in everyday experience into your lessons? When do you want to keep it out? How do you want to sequence knowledge? When do you want to open up assessments and give choices to the learners? And when do you, as the teacher, keep control? So we used that as a starting point from his book, Cracking the Code. And so from these choices that every teacher needs to think about in relation to every lesson they do, we started to think about what was not happening, what were students not learning in the classroom space that we could really push in a learning from practice module. And that was about the teacher thinking. That it really feels difficult for students to not just to observe teachers' work, but to see what they're doing and why they're doing it. And we're going to pick that up a lot more in the second session. What the other thing we could do in a learning from practice module is, instead of putting a student in a classroom for an 8-week period or a 10-week period or whatever it is, we could show them lots of different lessons recorded of a very diverse context with different learners at different stages of the education system and over different subjects. So they could see teaching in contexts that were very, very far or remote from where they actually live and the kind of schools in which they went. And so that kind of gives a bit of a rationale for the teacher choices in action module. And the 2 pictures that you see there are 2 classroom lessons or artifacts that that were used in the module, and we're going to talk about them a lot more in this session. And it was great that the Department of Higher Education and Training came on board with funding as part of the Teaching and Learning Development Capacity Improvement Program. And so they helped us get this up and running and the materials developed. So let's talk about a problem in teacher education that is certainly seems to be international, but is very, very prevalent in the South African context. And that is that the teacher education courses are divided into these modules. And these modules are taught as standalone courses with very, very little connection or very little interaction between them. And I just want to, hear from other people who are maybe involved in teacher education, whether you've got a very integrated curriculum or whether your courses are also quite isolated from one another. Anybody want to? To comment?
If you don't mind.
Please.
Yeah, I teach teacher training courses in Japan, and they're actually isolated to the point where each individual professor's course is separated from everybody else. They're just, you're in a similar situation. teacher education, will be separated into these sort of subsets, and then one professor will be assigned that particular subset, and they won't necessarily see what's being done in other classes by other professors, or necessarily even, you know, get to communicate with those professors about what's being taught.
I think that was a big finding from a national research project that I was involved in several years ago in South Africa. When we looked at teacher education curriculum, they were absolutely in these silos. And very, very useful knowledge. I mean, I think that since Shulman did his knowledge typology, there really has been this move towards giving prospective teachers a solid knowledge base. But the problem is, you know, to get the depth of knowledge, you've got to have these separate courses, but the students are struggling to see connection. So there's learning theories, but not so much theories of teaching, for example. And each of these courses can potentially inform how you teach. But the first is whether there's total segmentation of the modules. So it's possible that subject knowledge is connected to subject pedagogies, but in some courses they work as separate entities. It's possible that inclusive education, which should help you to understand the barriers of learning that the kids face, gives you principles for how to teach. Sometimes it's connected to sociological structures of schooling, sometimes it's not. But a big thing that my colleague Elizabeth Walton and I have written about quite extensively is that the body of knowledge about inclusive education is taught totally separately to the body of knowledge about subject knowledge and subject pedagogies. Even our policy in South Africa expects that all these different types of teacher knowledge fuse together in the moment of practice as if it's a magic wand and it just happens. So when I surveyed students at the end of their fourth year of study, and I asked them to answer this: how do I see how the modules of my course link together to inform my practice? Only 2/3 agreed with that. So you're getting to a point where 1/3 of the students are leaving university in what we thought was a very, very connected teacher education program, still not seeing the links. And Hoban from Wollongong, I think, expressed it really well, how globally teacher education programs tend to be fragmented, notable for their absence of links, and it's left to students to make their own connections. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And the problem is that if they don't make those connections, they don't ever come to see teaching as a practice with a logic within itself. We're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. And so when we developed the Teacher Choices in Action module, if you just have a look at where I've got asterisks, those are all the modules, the units in the module that draws on legitimation code theory in one way or another. So for example, choosing to be a teacher talks about the knowers. Unit 3 with selecting knowledge and sequencing knowledge talks about autonomy tours and semantic waves. Cumulative learning picks up on knowledge building, feedback picks up again on semantic waves, and it all comes together in, you know, who you are as a knower. So LCT comes in a lot at different points in the 6 modules that, the 6 units that this module offers. The 2 that I'm going to just go into in a little bit more detail today are the sequencing knowledge and the feedback, one from unit 3 and one from unit 4. And what I'm going to show you here is how seeing different practices enacted in different contexts is really useful in getting kind of to the logics of practice. So the first thing I'm going to look at is Miss Flanagan's WhatsApp chat. And what we do with that is we used it as a logic to firstly look at the context and how Miss Flanagan's talked a particular topic. And then we used it to teach the students a logic for sequencing lesson steps, both analyzing it and of course doing it in their practice at some later point. So that's what I'm going to move on to now. So this is Claire Flanagan. She's a mathematics teacher, and I'd like you to just listen to a little bit. She's going to talk a little bit about herself, her school, and what she did in a quite poor environment to carry on teaching and learning during lockdown.
My name's Claire Flanagan. I got into teaching fairly late in life, and I am now teaching grade 8 maths at a quintile 3 township school in the Johannesburg area. So maybe about half to a third of the families are unemployed and relying on social grants. I did this because I was convinced that maths could be taught better in South Africa, and particularly get away from the rote learning and teach more understanding. Anyway, I'm also reasonably technically competent, so by the early 2020, I'd already been using WhatsApp groups with my learners. Kind of think you should keep up your maths practice over the holidays, so I would send them like daily maths puzzles. Then lockdown hit and we had to work out how to carry on teaching. So we could have used a learning management system, I suppose, but that was never really an option for us. It needs large screens and lots of data and a lot of organising of the learners. The option at the other end of the scale was to send the kids notes, printed notes, every couple of weeks, bring them back every couple of weeks and mark and return them. And that just doesn't work in teaching. You have to give immediate feedback. So we already had the WhatsApp groups, and that actually did turn out to be probably the best option anyway. Everyone's familiar with WhatsApp, so you don't have to teach them how to install it and use it or anything like that. It can be reasonably low on data, or you can buy low-cost social data packages. So we just carried on using WhatsApp. So I would send out a bit of mental maths and some notes on a specific topic and some practice exercises, so maybe something about fractions, and the next day I would send them answers. Some of them would do the work, take a photo, submit it back, and I'd mark it and return it to them. And I would keep track of the kids who'd done that, and every now and again bug the ones who hadn't sent me anything. And in the end, I'm not sure that it actually helped any of them academically, but what it did do, I think, was help me build relationships with the kids and with their parents, many of whom were also on the groups. So what you could do is, if a kid had a specific problem, they could have an offline chat with a private chat with you, and you could speak to them. And a lot of them, I think, did that, not because they wanted to find out about the maths, but because they just wanted to stay in touch with somebody during the lockdown. My name's Claire.
Okay, so we used Claire's, one of the private conversations, the one-on-one conversations that she had with one of the learners in her class as an artifact, as a resource for students to analyze in the teacher choices in action. And you've seen here how some of the things inform, you know, her thinking. So in the community, there are very few homes that have computers or access to the internet. Power is unreliable, but all the kids had mobile devices and they data bundles. And she had the WhatsApp groups already set up. And so when it came to keeping in contact, you know, they already had that technology, and it was just not possible or feasible in terms of the context in which she taught to do full on online, you know, Google Classrooms kind of teaching. The particular child that I'm going to show you an interaction between her and that child had just come to an English speaking school. So his ability to communicate in English was still developing, and his reading level was quite low. So what she did was, when she was interacting with him in text messaging on WhatsApp, she used deliberately very simple words, short sentences, but still was able to take him through a learning pathway, trying to teaching him the concepts expenditure, income, profit, and then take it into some sort of algebraic equation. So let's have a look at the WhatsApp chat that was one of the resources that we used in the teacher choices in action. She starts with asking him something completely different to where she wants to go in this particular lesson. You have a shop, what do you want to sell? Ice cream. So that's the in, that's the hook. And then once the child has committed himself to an answer, she then sets up this example about buying ice creams, and you pay this and you charge your friends for that, and this is and so on. And every time, show me how you get your answer, workings and answers, please, and so on. And look at the feedback that she gives. That's it. That's correct. Correct. So she takes him on this problem. Once she's seen that the kid follows the empirical example, she starts to then name the concepts and starts to cluster these three ideas: expense, income, and profit. And she defines each one. What does she do then? She takes another example, try another example, and takes him through the reasoning again, and then lands up asking the kid to put those three concepts into a mathematical relationship. So there are many, many ways that we could use LCT to analyze this as a learning pathway. If you were using autonomy, for example, and the target is understanding expense, income, and profit and the relationship between them, you would see an autonomy tour here where, when she's talking about what do you want to sell in your shop, the ice cream is completely in the exotic code, and she then turns it to purpose and then takes it back to the sovereign. The way that we wanted to use this in the teacher choices in action was looking at the semantic waving that she does in this very, very simple WhatsApp conversation. So what I'd like to do now is to show you just a couple of minutes of how we introduced semantic waving and semantic waves to the students in the Teacher Choices in Action module, and then we'll go into how they worked with Miss Flanagan's WhatsApp conversation.
When friends and family members speak together, they share personal experiences and talk about the things around them. Conversation moves from one topic to another. Through these conversations, people build relationships and learn a lot of knowledge about living in their communities. In their professional practices, experts have learned to use specialist ideas called concepts to talk to one another about the work they do. The discussions that teachers have with learners during lessons are different to the conversations people have at home. They are also different to the conversations experts have with one another at work. Classrooms are the place where these two kinds of conversations come together. During their lessons, teachers help learners to have conversations about complex concepts and about real-world experiences and examples. Keeping learners busy during lessons does not guarantee worthwhile learning. A learning pathway should give learners access to more complex knowledge over time. Learners need opportunities to think about complex concepts. They also need to see how complex concepts can help them understand what is going on in the real world around them and beyond. It is possible to have lessons where teaching is happening but not much learning is taking place. If lessons always focus only on experiences and examples, learners do not have access to complex concepts. When lessons cover what learners already know, another way that learning might not happen much is if the teacher does not make complex concepts understandable. If teachers use only specialist language when introducing new ideas in their lessons, the knowledge can seem very difficult and strange. It is useful to think of learning pathways as semantic waves. Semantic waves represent how the learning pathway moves between complex concepts at the top of the graph, as well as the experience and examples shown at the bottom and back again. Semantic waves also help teachers to think about the order or sequence of their lesson steps. Semantic waves can start at different places. They all move upwards, downwards, and back again. In some lessons, teachers introduce a complex concept using specialist terminology. They could say something like, "Today we are going to learn about." There might be a few learners who know what it means, but most would not. The semantic wave starts high. Using easier words and language, teachers then work with learners to unpack the concept into simpler parts. To do this, they may use easier words, or they may break the concept down into parts. She checks if the learner has understood enough to use the concepts in an example. The next step of the learning pathway is to check if the learner can repack his understanding into a complex form. Now we will look at a differently shaped semantic wave. Teachers often start a lesson inviting learners to share their experiences. They may introduce learners to examples or a resource to which they can respond. In these cases, the semantic wave starts at the bottom, with real-world experiences or examples. For learning to happen, it needs first to move up, then down again. Read the WhatsApp conversation between a grade 8 learner and his maths teacher. The teacher is helping the learner to understand the concepts of income, expenses, and profit. We are going to see how semantic waves help us understand the lesson steps in this conversation.
Okay, so that was then how we led up to the semantic waves and then to give the students this WhatsApp conversation and lead into the sequencing of lesson steps. So they were introduced to a particular shape of a semantic wave, and then they were shown how the first step of the lesson is going from an example, an imaginary example, and building up the understandings of particular concepts. Logically, the next lesson step is at the high part of the wave where the actual concepts are being discussed. The next part of the lesson is the application to another example. And the last part of the learning process is where they're putting the parts and seeing relationships between the three different concepts. And so this we felt was a really accessible, easy example for them to see that it's not just a random sequence of busyness or activity, but there's actually a logic in how one sets up the learning pathway. And that is really, really important because a kind of a rule of thumb or a tip or a maxim that's very often given to the students is either always start your lessons by finding out what the students know, or always start your lessons with what the students know. And it's almost like caricature that it's so simplistic, it's overly simplistic. And it really is a problem, because what it does is it completely obscures the complexity of designing a learning pathway. You know, so it gives a starting point, but then what? Where do you go from there? And then you can get trapped in that low semantic flatline. Or is it always good to start with what the students know? What about if they're bringing in masses of misconceptions and you actually want to distance them from that? So I just want to also just invite anybody who's here to, if you've got experience, is this, you know, something that you've heard students say or advice given to your student teachers? Because to me, it's one of these examples that is so overly simplistic that it does more harm than good.
Dominic says that that he was given this advice as a student teacher 20 years ago.
I was told it too. Yeah.
And Sarah says that pre-service teachers often struggle with what that actually means to start with what students know.
Mm.
I think that's really difficult, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to show my face. I'm in my pajamas, but but it's really, I know what that means. I think it has potential or merit, but you're absolutely right, Lee. What does that mean for a novice teacher to actually, when they don't know what it feels like, to realize if a student knows something or not, doesn't know something, and where do you start?
Yeah. That's so interesting, Sarah, because I mean, I've deliberately chosen this picture as being overly simplistic, like a rarefied, you know, if I was working in the semantic plane, I would probably say that this is a rarefied example of a kind of an oversimplistic tip. But, you know, some of them, you know, certainly I've come across it a lot in South Africa, where the students, you know, what are you going to do in your introduction? We're going to activate prior knowledge. Like, what does that mean?
Oh,
and then, yeah.
It's taken me 25 years to work out what on earth that is. I wrote it down in a diary in my pre-service teaching days, and it really struggled to understand what that meant.
Mm. And unfortunately, what we see then is that the students got the sovereign in mind, you know, the target knowledge, and knows what they've got to get to, but they are so busy activating prior knowledge that they never get out of the exotic. And their lessons, before they know it, it's the end of the lesson and they haven't yet even got to introducing the concept. It's not helpful. So what we felt is that what semantic waves do, it gives a sophisticated, principled, nuanced way of thinking not only of the starting point, but then where do you go from there? So if you're down, you know, if you start low, stay there for a while, then move up. Stay there for a while, then move down, and so on. And if you've been in a kind of low a little bit too long, it's time to move up. If you've been high too long, it's time to move down. And it starts to give a logic of the kind of thinking that we want from the students, instead of this random, busy activity after activity after activity that simply just keeps them occupied or never gets beyond activating prior knowledge, that they can actually start to think of a learning pathway. So we introduced this whole idea with working through Claire Flanagan's WhatsApp conversation, but then we took that to different lessons, different observations as well. You'll see a little bit later on how we started there and we used that as the kind of the analytic, and then we asked them to apply it again in the same way. Apply to other examples. Can you see the semantic wave here? Can you see the semantic wave there? And how are they different? But it's that common language and that common framework that works across the different subjects, across the different contexts, at different levels of the schooling system. One of the things we did right at the end was we asked them, what did you find most valuable in the Teacher Choices in Action module? And thousands spoke particularly about the benefits of semantic waves as a logic for thinking through their lesson steps. This is one of the many, one of the thousands. I'm going to now move on to another part of the teacher practices that we wanted to students to think about in this Teacher Choices in Action module, and that is Mr. Wilmot's lesson on slam poetry. And we used that lesson as a way of providing feedback. Now, if you think back to Claire Flanagan's WhatsApp chat, when she was providing feedback, it was, that's right, good, correct, that's correct, okay? Because she was testing whether they understood, whether this particular kid understood these concepts and how they worked in a practical example. Mr. Wilmot's feedback is very, very different. It's got a different form, it's got a different structure. And we used that as a way of illustrating how to give feedback and again, reinforcing the idea of semantic waves. So let's hear from Mr. Wilmot, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his school and about this unit of lessons that he taught during lockdown.
I teach at St. Dunstan's College in Benoni, which is a small private fee-paying school that caters to an upper middle income population. It has an Anglican ethos and the language of instruction is English. Most of our learners come from English language backgrounds, and the majority of our teachers have been trained in the Google Program for Education. Most of our learners also have access to electronic devices and Wi-Fi. And we have a very active and involved parent community who are very concerned about the achievement of their children. But it was still a great shock when on the 18th of March 2020, we had to make the big shift from in-person classroom-based learning on campus to online learning. Our first objective was to maintain contact with our pupils throughout lockdown and supply them with learning materials and resources that would keep them going through the long stretch. So we set up Google Classrooms on which we posted resources and learning materials, interacted with them using various electronic message boards, and also conducted our assessments. And we decided that since poems can be taught as self-contained, discrete units, although part of a larger framework, it would allow us to more effectively teach with constraints of online learning. So we decided to focus on protest poetry through the ages. We were able to trace a direct line of descent from William Blake to modern slam poets. This also allowed us to integrate language activities, creative tasks, and online debates and discussions regarding the themes covered in the slam poems. We felt that modern incarnation of protest poetry is probably slam poetry. Slam poetry and song lyrics are also some of the most accessible media for our learners to access poetry. So we created a page on our Google site on which we shared a number of slam poems and offered them as examples to our pupils of the genre of slam poetry. They were required, by viewing those website resources, to infer from them exactly what the form, the structure, the intention, and purpose of slam poetry is. We wanted them to observe the meter, the rhyme, the rhythm, and various important literary elements. They were then required to write their slam poems and perform them while recording them on their computers. The slam poems were shared on Flipgrid.
This is the first day that the students are back from the COVID lockdown, and I wanted to get some feedback from them as to how they experienced the lockdown and how they were feeling emotionally. So I just wanted to really check in with them. I also wanted to give them some feedback on the work they'd done during lockdown. My intention is to go through some of the best pieces of work that were submitted and also to consolidate the learning that took place over lockdown. So during lockdown, this class did quite an intensive poetry theme, a block of poetry study, approximately 12 poems that they had to analyze and interpret, and this culminated with their having to actually write their own slam poems. And I thought one way of consolidating a lot of the skills that were covered in terms of things like analysis and poetic devices, figures of speech, rhyme and rhythm, and meter would be to look at some of the learners' poems.
Okay, so what we see here is, remember, Claire Flanagan's lesson and Mark Wilmot, both of them are done in the unit on resources, infrastructure, and the context in which one teaches. And here we see a very different context to the one that Claire Flanagan was working on. So middle class, affluent, well-resourced computer and internet facilities at school and at home. And so doing an extended online learning was absolutely an option for Mark, where it simply was not the option for Claire. And to have those contrasting examples of how both of them were contextually responsive in their pedagogy is phenomenal for students. So how did he do it? Let's have a look. I'm going to just play you a couple of minutes of this very entertaining lesson. Sorry, Claire, Carol, just in terms of introducing the idea of feedback, do you want to pick up on, to come in here and just chat about how we built up the idea of looking for feedback?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lee. So one of the things we did in the module was to try and give students some sort of principles about formative feedback. And we drew on Hattie and Timperley's work there. And the three kind of particular things we focused on were that the kind of feedback you can give to learners is personal, where you could say something like just well done or good effort or whatever. It's often not particular about the actual product. You can also give feedback on the process that they're using, kind of try to get them to think about their metacognition processes, kind of why are you saying that? Why do you think it's like that? Trying to get them to explain a bit more about the answer that they've given. And then the third one that we looked at was feedback on the actual product. What have they actually produced? And to what extent does it meet the criteria, if there are clear evaluative criteria or not? And this was one of the key things that we found in South African education, that often teachers don't give very clear feedback. So learners often don't know actually how well they're doing, and they don't really know how they can improve. So that was one of the reasons for trying to provide these kinds of criteria for feedback. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Carol. And so, I mean, what Mark does in this lesson is provide the most astounding example of feedback on the product, which is the poems. Just take a look. Sorry. It was important to contextualize that they had done all these different examples of poem, and from that extracted the meaning and the attributes of what makes slam poetry distinctive. And through that, he was able to point out the distinctive attributes. And we see a constellation here of context, performance, and a text, where the performance, the body language counts, the facial gestures, the voice, and so on. And the text, he was talking about the imagery, the word choice, how you use it in the rhythm, the kind of the form, and how all that came and was extracted from those examples. And the students were then asked to go back to their personal context and exemplify the form, reflecting all these kind of attributes in their slam poets. Now let's get to the lesson.
Yeah. I want to give you some feedback though about the work that you submitted. I think that the work that you submitted was exceptional quality of work. I'd like to actually share with you some of the work that you submitted. What I want to do is I also want us to think about how some of your slam poems reflected quite strongly on what you were going through. Morgan and I had a little bit of an exchange about some work that was outstanding, and I can see that your poem came from an angry place, because your teacher was in your case and your parents were in your case. As you watch these protest poems that I want to show you, your performance poems or slam poems, what I'd like you to do is to think about the elements of performance in these poems. Remember when you were studying slam poetry, we spoke about how slam poetry is a performance art. So it's not just about the text itself, but it's about the delivery of the poem. It's got a lot to do with the use of your body, with facial expression, with the intensity of your voice, with the delivery. So the power of your delivery. But I also wanted you to use a variety of different poetic devices or literary devices. So I wanted you to use a range of figures of speech to think about how you could use a variety of sentence constructions, how you could make use of rhythm and rhyme, and make use of a variety of sound devices in your work as well. All of those things that we studied, I wanted you to apply in your work. So while we watch these poems, and we start with Morgan's, I want you to think not only about the power of the delivery, which was outstanding, but also about how she used a range of these poetic techniques in her work.
Rotten pickets, coated in white, a never-ending fart. Thumbs are the only finger saved from gesture. Here comes another lecture, accompanied by your favorite fool, the #1 jester, carefully tiptoeing like the nutcracker, only to be deemed a slacker.
Tell us about the inspiration for your poem, because it obviously came from a very powerful, emotional energy that you were experiencing at the time, and from a very deep personal place.
Yeah, I wrote in like 10 minutes because my mom was like, I'm coming upstairs to see if you submitted your slam poetry and it hadn't started. Sorry.
So, who picked up some, first of all, the performance elements in her poem?
She used her facial expression very well.
Excellent. She made very good use of facial expression. What range of expressions was she indicating on her face? What emotion was she conveying through facial expression?
Exasperation.
Right, so exasperation, frustration with the situation. Nice. Yeah. Talk to me about Morgan's use of body language, of gestures, of movement.
She used her hands a lot.
Right, absolutely. She used her hands, she made use of gesture. So there were all those important performance elements. And her tone of voice. Did you notice that she varied the tone of her voice, but underlying there was quite a strong kind of sarcastic tone, I think. Rotten pickets coated in white, a never-ending fight. Very interesting that, because what is she alluding to or referring to in that line, rotten pickets?
The poem. So the white picket fence is the ideal living situation, but obviously facade coated in white.
Very, very nice. A very powerful image. I'm sure you've all heard of the story, the image or the metaphor of the white picket fences. I think it comes from America.
Yeah.
But it's the idea of the ideal suburban existence. But as you say, that it's rotten and yet covered in white. So creating an appearance, an outward appearance of this, suburban bliss?
Yeah.
But with it, this tension underlying it, hey?
Yes.
Nice. A never-ending fight. Thumbs are the only fingers spared from gestures. Here comes another lecture. Very interesting. So is that a reference to the scolding parent?
And the other one.
The middle finger.
Yeah, I'm just playing though.
That's very interesting. So the scolding finger would be the parental finger, and then the middle finger would be the defiance. Yeah.
Okay, so how did we pedagogize this? First of all, it was really important that our students understood that we were talking about a constellation of ideas here, and a constellation of attributes that makes slam poetry distinctive. And so we asked them to identify from a list what were the kind of the elements of slam poetry that Mr. Wilmot's class had been working with. So that was just a way to kind of elude them or alert them to the fact that you've got the performance elements, the text elements, and you've got a contextual situation. So that just gives a little bit of context to what they did before they went and looked at the feedback itself. So the semantic waving in Mr. Wilmot's lesson, first he looks at the performance art form, and I'm going to just show you the narration of how this is unpacked for the students before they do their own analysis on other examples.
This task shows how a teacher uses process and product feedback to give learners messages of what matters when using slam poetry to express themselves. Mr. Wilmot is an English teacher in Ekurhuleni. He uses semantic waves to make his feedback meaningful for all the learners. Through his classroom conversations, he helps to develop their gaze about appreciating and writing good poetry. By linking Morgan's poem and the nature of slam poetry, Mr. Wilmot creates semantic waves in his lesson. He uses Morgan's poem as an example that demonstrates the nature of slam poetry. He shows how Morgan's poem conveys anger and frustration. He asks the class to think about how she used her voice, hands, and face to give a powerful performance. He points out a range of poetic devices that convey powerful images. He discusses with them the meaningful message in her poem. Through the semantic waves in his lesson and his use of feedback, Mr. Wilmot helps learners to develop a gaze to appreciate poetry. This results in cumulative learning because it offers learning that is valuable beyond just Morgan's poem. It is transferable beyond the context. It develops their gaze, which can be transferred to appreciating and writing better poems in the future.
So we're using semantic wave yet again, but in a completely different context, in a different part of teachers' practice. Instead of planning lesson steps, we're now using it in terms of a criteria for providing feedback against the examples, against the genre. Sorry, let me just move a little bit back. So how does LCT take us forward in this? And I think that what we were able to do in the Teacher Choices in Action module was to look at very different, the same practice in very different contexts. And LCT gave us that language to be able to talk about teachers' practices in various ways, whether it was lesson steps, whether it was feedback, whether it was learner tasks, and so on. And you saw through the narration how, words like Noah, gaze, cumulative learning, semantic waves, and so on, complex concepts, linking with examples, linking with experience, it just became part of the way that we spoke to the students about these examples that we analyzed with them, and then they took those examples and we wanted to see whether they were then able to use those concepts and use those languages to observe and analyze other lessons and other artifacts in informed ways that they hadn't been able to do before. And that's what we're going to be doing in our in the second session. But what we really just thought was so powerful here is being able to look at the same lessons with who you're teaching and where you're teaching, and then the same lessons and how what you're teaching matters and how that's enacted in various ways. Where we're going to go from now is what next? Really thinking about how these teachers were thinking about what they needed to consider in different ways. and we think that the specialization dimension of LCT probably provides us with the conceptual and the analytic tools to think about this. You know, Ms. Flanagan was looking at concepts, how they were connected, how they could be introduced, what examples to use, whereas Mr. Wilmot was looking at, you know, what are the attributes of this particular genre? Which examples do I select? How do I get the students to interact with them? How do they reveal their understanding, not through producing the correct answer as was done with the WhatsApp chat, but rather through creative expression in the form and with the attributes of this genre, and how the criteria are reflected in their work. And so that just gives you a little bit of a taste of how we took LCT, how we took teachers' practices, and how we worked with it in the Teacher Choices in Action module. I want to just stop there before we, you know, I don't want to jump straight into the next session that Dale and I are going to do together, but just if there's anything that you'd like to share or that stood out for you or that resonated with something that you do in your context, I would really love to hear about that. Okay.
Hi, Lee.
Yeah, hi, Sarah.
I'm just saying this is revelation. This is revolutionary or revelationary. Both of them are appropriate. And the reason why is because I see it, and I'm part of a program that tries to activate students' knowledge. We try and do that Tylerian model of teaching, starting with the lesson plan and getting the, but you don't see the principles until you're much more experienced as a teacher, and then it all comes together. And you've found a way to fast track that. And I think we should all do that too. It's great.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Sarah. That's really interesting. I think that, you know, I mean, you could see how we really tried to make this having a very strong South African feel, because we were dealing with South African problems here about the quality or the lack of quality in their work-based learning. But the more we did it, the more that we actually saw that perhaps these are problems that are occurring beyond our context.
Most definitely. I'm now going to go and think about our Aboriginal context in Northern Australia, where we have a huge demographic from Indigenous students, and this is perfect because we also have internet connection problems and device problems, and actually that's not an excuse.
Rita, I see your question about whether this is running post-COVID. That's actually a lovely question. So it was definite. It was intended as a COVID intervention, and that's how it emerged. But the universities that have done it have found that there was so much valuable learning that took place that prepared them for work-based learning, but also that helped consolidate their work-based learning, that the universities are still offering it beyond COVID, even though now, you know, the schools are open and students are free to go into the schools for their practicals. In fact, I think we've had just between now and the beginning of the year, we've had 3 more universities come on board to register their groups of students and so on. 2 universities I know have changed their curriculum to make sure that this is either part of their official work-based learning or that it's done part of their coursework before the students go into the schools. So yeah, it's I think we had 15,000 last year students completing. This year it went up to 44,000, and yeah, the South African Council of Educators is also very, very interested in how would this be useful for practicing teachers who wanting a language of practice, and even possibly to do a second level of this course, like a more advanced level, in their first year of teaching, instead of watching other people's lessons and videos that we unpack for them, that they take these concepts into their own context and their own teaching. So there we have it. Cool. Can we move on to the next part of our presentation?